we'll have the procurement police all over us.
There we go.
Okay, that's brilliant.
We've got
that's marvellous. Thank you. Right. Okay. Look, the purpose of this morning, the tender that we have issued for work on the delivery of the Northwest Industrial Cluster Plan is really, really important to us. Really important. So we wanted to just provide this oral briefing just to make sure that what we'd sent out in writing was absolutely clear and people have got a good understanding of what we're after, and also to offer prospective tenderers the opportunity to sort of ask sort of some further questions, but do that in open forum. And as I said before the recording started, we will put this recording up on the tender's website. We'll put the slides up on the tender's website, and we'll do that almost immediately after the event has finished. So I will talk for possibly, we've got 3/4 of an hour, so I'll talk for the next sort of 10-15 minutes or so, no more than that, and then we'll leave up to half an hour for questions if you've got them. So Harry, I don't know whether you want to sort of stick the slides up on the screen. That's fantastic. Right. Okay. Well, let's go straight to the sort of go beyond the sort of title page and onto the cluster plan itself. So just a quick reminder, sort of quick contextualization of what this cluster plan is. So Northwest Net Zero sort of were commissioned by Innovate UK, and I think I'm right in saying, Kerry and Melissa, I think best part of £1 million from Innovate UK for the entire cluster plan work. Is that right, or have I overestimated that?
Yeah, I think we were just talking to Idric. They said it was about 1.25 million per cluster.
Yeah, so there's a lot of money gone into this cluster from Innovate UK with the purposes of producing a plan that would set out how each of those industrial clusters would get to net zero by 2040, and about £100,000 of that £1.25 million came through the LEP, and we were tasked with producing with the business case, and we contracted with Mace to do that work. I say that the plan that we've got sort of I've got some Joe. Matthew. Yes, I'm sorry. I was getting a little bit of interference from other parts of people's offices. So thank you for going on to mute. So that plan, the plan that we have developed in the Northwest, actually has two routes that will get us to net zero by 2040. One route that is quite heavily dependent on hydrogen. Another route that is sort of a more mixed economy solution, but both of those routes offer good value for money, and that route, sort of certainly the mixed economy route, sort of sets out a £30 billion investment plan that would need to be delivered if we're going to achieve the objective. Most of that £30 billion will be invested by the private sector, you know, what this project is about is trying to understand whether or not the private sector will just get on and deliver that plan without sort of any need for coordination between them, any need for intervention or engagement with the public sector, or whether you know, some sort of central coordination, some sort of central intervention with or without the public sector will be necessary. So if we can go on to the sort of the waterfall, and really kind of the next 3 slides very quickly to illustrate the you know, the sheer complexity of what we are talking about. So you know, that shows what we have, or what the cluster plan describes as the waterfall. You know, current emissions, 16.7 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent per annum. The first 1.9 million tonnes per annum taken out through sort of scope 1 energy efficiency. 4.6 million tonnes to be, if I go sort of 4 steps on, for power sector decarbonisation. and the final 2.2 million tonnes, which actually gets us to below net zero through bioenergy, sort of carbon capture and storage. But what you can see there is several different elements to this, all of which will need to be successfully delivered if we are to achieve our objectives. And we'll go on to sort of in a short while. All of those got lots and lots of interdependencies, both between each other and also interdependencies within the sort of each of the elements. So if we can go onto the next slide. And what we've got here are, some of the key challenges that we think that that all of this is likely to face. There is pure planning, and we have run into some of that already. HyNet, as part of their process, is having to consult on or go through planning for both carbon and hydrogen pipelines that run across Cheshire, and another carbon pipeline which actually runs through Derbyshire and is already showing signs of getting quite a bit of opposition from places in northeast Cheshire which don't think that they're part of this decarbonisation process, but nevertheless they're going to have to see the pipeline sort of put through their area. There may well be funding and financing challenges, skills challenges, potentially supply chain challenges, and so on and so forth. All sorts of things that you would expect. And I think interestingly, there also the system-wide thinking, needing to see this as a single system, and it is a single system, not least because it's all, a lot of it is all joined together by the national grid. The national grid itself has got challenges. And Kerry, remind me of the stat. Sorry, I don't want to Kerry. Melissa, remind me of the stat that came out from National Grid actually this week about the scale of the investment that they are needing to make compared to what they've done sort of over the last 30 years. I think it's several times what they've done over the last 30 years in terms of investment, haven't they?
I can't remember, Philip, but it is, orders of magnitude.
It is, and all of this complicated by the fact that if getting to net zero wasn't enough, we've also got the challenges of rapidly transitioning away from Russian gas to give us sort of energy security. And actually, in truth, as we understand it, the government saying to National Grid, please prioritise energy security and making our energy system sort of more robust to the sorts of challenges that it's faced over the last couple of years following the invasion of Ukraine, rather than getting to net zero. So there are a number of challenges there, and as I say, the national grid challenge is something that sort of influences the whole system. And if we just go back to sort of just the waterfall for just a second, there are even questions within there, if told by National Grid that it can support some but not all of that waterfall, there may be questions about where the priorities should lie. And then if I can go on to the next slide, which is the Net Zero Northwest ecosystem. That's quite a plate of spaghetti there. That just goes to show how many companies, how many external agencies are involved in all of this. In fact, I was looking at it last night. I can't see the LEPs anywhere, but nevertheless, there's sort of the LEPs there as well. But it is a complex system, and many of those organisations will be involved in each element of the of cluster delivery, and then many of them will be involved in many of those elements of the cluster delivery. So it is complex, and there is a question about how we ensure that all of those organisations, all of those companies, are moving in the same direction and at the right pace. Because what are we in the middle of 2023 now? I don't need to I don't need to tell anybody how challenging it is likely to be to deliver a £30 billion investment programme in 16 and a half years, if I've done the if I've done the maths if I've done my maths correctly or my arithmetic correctly. And then kind of pretty much the final substantive slide, the project itself. Starting with the fundamental question: is any degree of central coordination required at all? Sort of somebody was saying to me the other day, if we look at the recent announcement about the battery plant that Tata are going to invest in Somerset, without a doubt, sort of quite a substantial slug of government subsidy, both directly into the plant, but I think kind of some other deals that government has done with Tata around, for example, the help that they will provide with decarbonising their steel plants and so on and so forth. But fundamental to Tata's decision to invest in Somerset was the fact that the government has committed to their to a ban on selling cars with tailpipe emissions from 2030, and I think a suggestion which I think Melissa had picked up, that following the Uxbridge by-election, when the Prime Minister started to sort of hint that, well, maybe that 2030 deadline was, maybe there could be a little bit of pragmatic flexibility into it, and at which point Tata suddenly got sort of very, very nervous about, well, hang about, the fundamental reason why we're building this battery plant is because we know that there's going to be huge demand for batteries in the UK after 2030. You start removing that legislative constraint, and our business model starts to look very, very flaky. It may well be that a combination of those sorts of things, sort of in the industrial space, and where the other legislative requirements to get to net zero, the funding that the government put into basically sort of equalise, I think it put in some, it was £20 billion of funding into the hydrogen market to allow the cost of hydrogen to end users to come down to match that of other sources of energy. The steps it's taking to set up Great British Nuclear, and potentially to sort of drive the development of nuclear power stations. It may well be that those incentives and the other money that is already in the system means that our private sector partners in this industrial cluster have more than enough incentive just to get on and sort of deliver their decarbonisation, because it makes absolute sense for them to do so, and there is no intervention required. That central coordination will happen naturally because it will be in the interests of the private sector to do it anyway. But it also may not be that simple. If we go back, sorry, Kerry, if we can just go back to that previous slide, well, actually, and the previous one again, the planning process is going to be really, really important. Skills are going to be a challenge, with the public sector having an important role to play in the delivery of skills. And what's not on there, but probably needs to be, but it is linked to planning, is public acceptability. We've seen from the Uxbridge by-election that when we ask people to make changes to the way that they work, where they live and work, that they're not prepared to vote for it. We've seen in Whitby Village and Ellesmere Port huge amounts of opposition when people were asked to be part of that experiment about switching from natural gas to hydrogen, and that was in circumstances where Cadent and British Gas were prepared to pay for all of the costs of that transition and all of the costs of transitioning back to natural gas if the experiment didn't work. And there were a load of other incentives for people to switch to hydrogen rather than natural gas, and still sort of huge amounts of opposition from the general public to making those changes. So as we see, sort of the transition is bound to it's going to result in some people jobs changing. They we could get union opposition to that. It's going to involve, as we've already said, pipelines being built and opposition to that, and so on and so forth. So, so there may well be a number of other things that are where the public sector needs to be involved, and it may well be, as sort of touched on the sort of National Grid already. Got a where National Grid in theory a private sector company, but heavily influenced by sort of the steers it's getting from the central government about where priorities should be, and so on and so forth. And also, if we go, and if we do sort of actually go back to that Northwest ecosystem, Kerry, yeah, sort of legitimate questions about, even with all the right economic incentives in place, what is the prospect of actually having absolutely sort of perfectly honed economic incentives on every single one of those players against every single one of those projects. So I think sort of lots of questions about sort of good reason to test. If I can just go back to the project slide, Kerry, good reasons to test whether or not some sort of central coordination agency really is required, given that HyNet would argue that they've got on and delivered much of their hydrogen stuff without anybody sitting in the centre sort of directing operations. But if there is a need for that intervention, then the second stage of this project is then to just produce an initial high-level outline of what that intervention body, what that coordination body might look like, and then we envisage sort of if we get through to the stage where we agree that yes, we do need something. It could be coordination. It could be a sort of could just be coordination. It could be information exchange. It could be sort of almost direct delivery. If we get to the stage of saying that one of those is needed and we've got a high-level outline of what it is, then there's likely to be some follow-on work on the detailed design of that new body. We will have a steering group for this project. We're just forming that at the moment. We've had a lot of engagement in writing the ITT from industry partners and visiting a steering group that sort of is made up of the Energy Security Department, sort of IDRIC, the Industrial Decarbonisation Research and Innovation Centre, if I've remembered exactly what the acronym stands for, Net Zero Northwest, which sort of to some extent is sort of the ultimate client for this piece of work, Peel, who chair Net Zero Northwest, HyNet, given their strong interest in this, obviously Cheshire Warrington LEP, and then also the Northwest Net Zero Hub, which is the Northwest sort of based body. It's actually hosted by Liverpool City Region, which is providing us with the funding that is allowing us to do this work. But it is a really important piece of work, and central government is looking across at what we are doing because they are very keen to learn. They sort of, when we spoke to them about this, they were really clear and admitted that their focus is on sort of, they tend to think about sort of energy vectors, they tend to think about hydrogen, they think about sort of wind, they think about tidal, and they've not engaged in the question about, well, when it comes to it, when you've got a system to set up and a system to put in place, how does that get delivered locally? So they are very interested in this, and it may well be that what we do here sort of has quite an influence on what happens elsewhere in the country. And then very final slide from me. There's a load of supporting detail which hopefully will be reflected in your bids. Those are the sort of the two key sort of documents: the cluster plan itself, the business case, and then there is some information that is not in the published documents. And at the moment, we're only making available the published documents to you. But then there is further sort of commercially confidential or commercially sensitive material that the winning bidder, all of that will be made available to them, which includes a sort of a full list of every single project that is in the waterfall at this stage. So I think that's as much as I want to say. If we go sort of take off screen share, hopefully that gives you sort of a clear understanding of the questions that we're looking to answer, how far we want the project to get, and then sort of what would then follow on in a separate commission at a later date. So with that, I think I've taken a couple more minutes than I said I would do. Really want to just open up for any questions that you might have about sort of what we're looking to achieve and so on and so forth. So sort of over to you.
Thank you, Philip. That's brought a lot of clarity, I think, to the discussions that we've been having internally and putting forward our tender, and those slides made things really clear. I guess one thing that springs to mind is in the complexity of that ecosystem from the slide. There are a lot of stakeholders, and we understand that from the previous work, and colleagues. Richard sends his apologies, he's actually on holiday in Greece at the moment, so potentially on the receiving end of climate change over there, unfortunately. But I guess the question is, what is your expectation around the depth of stakeholder engagement with that ecosystem as part of this piece of work within a relatively constrained fee and a relatively short period of time?
I think there's some extent that's a sort of question for your judgment. I mean, the part of the, you know, there's two elements I think to this here. One is, you know, in practice, actually understanding how the ecosystem works, how the economic incentives work, and producing a rigorous analysis of whether or not any sort of central sort of engagement intervention is required at all. And then sort of if it is, then where is that intervention required? Then I think the next question is, you know, the extent to which the members of that ecosystem are prepared to engage with it, you know, and those two things are ever so slightly separate. You know, there is, if the only way we are going to get this cluster delivered is to be sort of, you know, fairly directional about what you know, how it's all going to work, then we have to be honest about that, and we have to say, and I think, you know, we would be looking for sort of, you know, for the report to say that, you know, someone saying I'm refusing to engage with this, well, yeah, fine, but if it's but if in refusing to engage with it means it's not going to get delivered, then we need to know that, and then we need to sort of deal with it accordingly. That second, you know, the second element of it is obviously we've got to have some buy-in from people. So I think it's a bit of a question about, you know, who are the most influential and important players, and ensuring they are bought into this, and I think sort of, and it may well be that for this project it's more of kind of, you know, getting the big and important and most influential players to the point where they're saying, okay, we kind of get it. We may have some issues about exactly how that's done and the extent to which we're going to allow you to interfere in our day-to-day business, but maybe that is something that is picked up in the sort of the in the subsequent sort of follow-on project, if there is one. Because I actually agree with you that you know, that there needs to be some buy-in from those stakeholders. But the first question is, you know, actually a sort of a slightly more almost academic question of, you know, do we need this? What is, you know, is there a case for this in the first place? Does that help?
It does, thank you. Thanks, Philip.
Right. Any other queries?
Matt,
Matthew,
have you
anything?
got a question?
No, I think you've repeated back to me a lot of the things I've been thinking about all the last few weeks, and so that's been really good to hear. I think maybe that first question is there a need, and actually testing, is there a need for this central coordination facility? Is that about presenting the entire Net Zero North landscape across both all those existing governance arrangements, looking at kind of the energy market, the systems approach, looking at all those interdependencies between those elements of the waterfall, and just displaying that in a clear picture? Or is it looking at the current ability of the different agency or organizations within the landscape to deliver against that, and therefore looking at the opportunity that a central facilitation kind of agency would have in terms of being able to deliver that better? I haven't worded that too well, but there's just so many complex elements that it's the way in which you frame that, I think, as well.
I think
it's a bit challenging.
I think it's probably more the former, but my instinct is that at least initially there's almost a helicopter view on this. The first question I would probably pose is the one that I alluded to. Given the amount of money that the government is already putting into this, and kind of the legislation and the signalling that the government has done about sort of maybe future legislation around net zero, is it the case that actually companies are going to deliver this decarbonisation anyway? It's to sort of to exaggerate to make the point, if the government passed a law tomorrow that said that all homes must switch to hydrogen heating by the end of 2025, every single one of us who've got a gas boiler will be racing out buying hydrogen heating. It doesn't require anybody else any other incentive to get people to act in the way that the government is mandating. And I think the very first question is, if you take sort of some of those examples, Uniper, which own the Connah's Quay power station, which is currently gas, they are going to switch to hydrogen, and the program management, the program management complexity of that is obviously hydrogen is more expensive, so they need to know that they'll be able to sort of generate power as cheaply as they can with natural gas in the first place. They will, including the sort of the cost of that transition, they'll need to know that they've got a ready source of hydrogen. That's the responsibility of HyNet. They will need to know that because they know that HyNet can't produce hydrogen sort of at the level they need on demand, they'll need to know that there is somewhere where that hydrogen is being stored and those stores are adequate, and that's somebody else who is responsible for that. They'll also need to know that someone else is prepared to build the pipelines, or that pipelines are being built, and so on and so forth. So if this were a single company, you'd have some project manager sitting in the middle of all of that, or program manager sitting in the middle of all of that, sort of doing the program plan and the project plan. However, if it is the case that either the government is pumping enough money or enough regulatory push on Uniper to make that switch, they'll make it anyway. And we don't need to get involved, and they'll sort out between themselves all the program management. And indeed, HyNet would argue that has been the case with the hydrogen project. It hasn't, HyNet in practice, actually, the type of role that we are talking about here and asking whether it's necessary, to some extent, has been played with HyNet on sort of the hydrogen program. But HyNet actually themselves are not a big investor into the hydrogen program, but they are the people that have sort of sat in the middle, made it happen. And the way they've been able to make it happen is because government has put, certainly at this stage, £1 billion into direct subsidy, and now have put £20 billion into the system that basically says, look, we'll bring the cost of hydrogen down to match that of other vectors. It has not required, any sort of, identified public stroke private or private sector agency, setting itself up as the sort of the net zero hydrogen sort of coordination agency to make that happen. It's happened because the government has put sufficient money and sufficient other regulatory and other incentives into the system to provide the right incentives for the private sector to do that. So there's that helicopter view on that aspect, and then there's that helicopter view around other things, such as all of what I've described is absolutely brilliant until National Grid come along, for example, and say, terribly sorry, but because we lack the investment, lack the skills, lack the capacity in order to sort of upgrade the grid at the pace that all of these things require, we can't do it all. So please, will you tell us which of these bits are most important? Or sort of, and that's the point where, maybe you do need sort of a central coordination agency. And, one or two people have said to me that also what tends to go on, and this is just sort of, this is information failures, if you want to put it in economist speak. There are lots and lots of people that go to National Grid or to go to Scottish Power around here or to Energy Northwest and say to them, we need an additional grid connection, or we need an upgrading of our connection into the local network. But they all go individually, and there are some questions about the extent to which Scottish Power, Electricity Northwest, National Grid themselves spot the fact that approach from company A, an approach from company B, and approach from company C, they all look quite disparate, and they all look they'll respond individually to company A, company B, company C, but actually, if somebody could get companies A, B, and C together, have a conversation, they might have been able to go collectively to sort of Scottish Power, National Grid, etc., and actually come up with a solution that sort of might have been better and might have worked, and so on and so forth. So it has been put to me that sort of there may well be sort of some benefits in having something that's identified as sitting at the centre of all of this, and it's just doing that sort of it's almost information exchange, and I've put it in terms of National Grid, but it could be else. But and all of that, certainly the first bit of that, the sort of the economic incentives, that's very much a helicopter view. Sort of maybe what I've just described in terms of coordination is a helicopter sort of, but hovering quite close to the surface, because you do need to get a little bit of an understanding of those interdependencies and the extent to which those interdependencies will resolve themselves if the economic incentives are strong enough. But actually, even if the economic incentives are strong enough, and I've given an example of the National Grid where actually it's unlikely, it is going to require sort of administrative intervention in order to sort of get the best possible outcome. So understanding some of where those interdependencies are, and then and then at sort of almost a theoretical level, the best way of resolving those. So that was a long answer, Matthew, but does it help?
No, of course it helps. I think it's massively complex, isn't it? And I think that way it comes back to your ITT and the need to have that the economic side of it as a model, and almost being able to kind of scenario test different economic frameworks, legislative kind of direction, and then assessing the ability and the capability of kind of the workforce, the supply chain to deliver all of those projects, whilst also understanding and mapping all those interdependencies between all those organizations. So yeah,
I think there is the it's the timescale aspect, because we're not allowing it to happen in its own time. because of the Climate Change Act 2050 commitment and the fact that the cluster's set up to achieve net zero by 2040. So that's where there may be, I think, a critical path, where if you don't hit certain aspects of that critical path, the whole programme goes out. Because we know when talking to sort of the DNOs about the national grid connections that at the moment it's very difficult, and projects are being told that they'll have to wait till 2035 or 2037 for a connection, when actually we're supposed to be in net zero by 2040. And then Philip, just the national grid thing, there was like 400,000 new jobs required in low carbon energy sector by 2050, and they need to increase the low carbon energy generation by 50% by then as well. So those are huge dependencies. And then just to sort of correct the record about the funding, although it was 8 million across 6 clusters, I think we actually got just over 600,000 for our direct project. And then the Connah's Quay example is just an example. For the record, it's an assumption, I think, that all power stations will convert to hydrogen.
Yeah, and I think from our perspective, and obviously we'll try and make sure this comes across in the tender, some of this is very similar to that work that we did in the with the Welsh Government, Matt, about what that, well, whether they needed a coordinating body and what that might look like. It'd be really helpful to, and I know that you probably reflect some of this back to us, but when you talk about the high level design of that intervention body, what elements of design would you expect to be part of that? Obviously, we've got some ideas and we've been planning that out, but it'd be really interesting to hear from you what you think that high level design should include.
Okay. I think we are envisaging that it's an outline. I think we're envisaging that the vast bulk of this work will be in stage 1, but that there is enough of an outline of what this might do and might look like that we can then sort of, take it to all of the stakeholders, get their buy-in, get them saying, yeah, okay, we see the case for it, we see what it will do, we broadly agree with, the areas that you are proposing that it should be sort of intervening in the way that it should be intervening, if intervening is the right word. And then that then allows us to then commission the next stage of the work with some confidence that that what we are looking to design is then to put the detailed design in place of an organisation that has broad support from sort of the industry and other stakeholders as a whole. But I think it would be broad. It's sort of it probably is of the order of you probably saying to us that, I don't know, it's a mega vehicle. It's got 1,000 staff and billions of pounds a year will be going through it all the way through to it's 3 people and it's a clearinghouse. It's an information exchange and testing with people and everywhere in between, sort of, and then testing with people and saying, well, does that feel right? Are you happy with it? Would you support it? And if so, right, okay, we'll go and do the detailed design work.
Thank
I
you.
probably didn't give you any of the answers you wanted, but anyway, that's logical. We don't know.
No, I think it's helpful to understand that it is that high level. That was our interpretation of it, that we might have some outline around governance, etc. Like you say, who should be involved in it, but in the time scale, working down into the detail is, as you've suggested, a separate piece of work.
Yeah. Okay.
Any other questions? That might be it from us. Unless Matt's got anything.
Thank you for your time. That was extremely interesting.
Okay, well that's brilliant. Well, okay, well let's say this has all been recorded. We'll put the recording up, put the slides up. So if you need to go back and sort of check anything. I'd normally at the end of these things say, right, any further questions, pick up the phone, but given this is a procurement, we can't. So I'm afraid you're on your own from here on in, I'm afraid. So and then I think the deadline for submission of tenders is 4 o'clock Monday afternoon. So yeah, so we'll sort of we'll be looking forward to seeing what you all put in. Okay, all right, that's brilliant.
Lovely.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for your
Cheers then.
time, everybody.
All right.
Appreciate
Thank you.
it. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Cheers.
Bye bye.
Cheers. Bye bye.
Bye.